Excellent. So, good morning, good evening, good afternoon, everybody. So great to see so many TIM division members and friends and colleagues on the call today. So I'm Rita Katila from Stanford. Together with Parisa Asar, we are organizing this workshop on responsible and ethical innovation. And I wanted to give a few reminders. The session is recorded. You already accepted that button when you joined. And as I mentioned, please have your camera on so we can make this as interactive as possible. Please stay muted. Please write your questions in the chat to get started. And we will pick a few questions for the panelists to answer after their presentations as time allows. And then in about 45 minutes, we will have a big Q&A with everybody with hand raises, and then we will ask you to unmute. So please stay tuned, please stay muted, camera on, and you will have a chance to participate in the discussion in about 45 minutes. So on behalf of Parisa Asar and myself, I wanted to give a few thanks before we get started here this morning. First off, I wanted to big thank you to the TIM division of the Academy of Management, Technology and Innovation Management Division. Elisa Operti and Marianne Feldman, the PDW and the program chairs this year have worked tirelessly trying to get these synchronous sessions happen, and they actually made it. They've been supporting and advocating us. This is a great way to see the community. We are so grateful that Academy and TIM is supporting these sessions and that everybody can join. I also wanted to thank our home center at Stanford Technology Ventures program supporting us. And I want to mention that STVP has launched a major new initiative called PEAK on responsible and ethical innovation and entrepreneurship. So after the session, if you have a chance to check out peak.stanford.edu for more innovation, for more information. A little background about this session. So I've been interested in ethical issues around innovation for a long time, especially as they relate to ethics in the medical sector, and specifically how physicians have this dual role. They're taking care of patients, but they're also physician entrepreneurs, starting companies and selling drugs and selling medical devices. This presents a trade-off or a dilemma for innovation, and this has been of huge interest to me for a long time. Parisa Asar, my co-host today, joined as our graduate program from Google about a year ago. Her dissertation is on responsible and ethical innovation, and she was working on those topics at Google as well. So, that's a little background for why we are here today. And before I turn it over to Parisa and to the panelists, I wanted to briefly introduce our agenda. If you can switch to next slide. So what we'll do is Parisa will introduce responsible and ethical innovation, our workshop topic today. Then we will hear from our panelists for about 5 minutes each. And we will also have a discussion, and then we will open it up for Q&A, closing remarks, and reflections at the end. I do hope, these are East Coast times, I do hope that you will ask questions, many questions in chat during the presentations. So please do not wait until the Q&A, and we will, as time allows, also ask the panelists to answer your questions. And check out the poll, by the by, if you have not already, about who should regulate AI, and we will announce the results later. And my last slide is to introduce our fabulous practitioner academic panel today. So we will start with two presentations. This is really a focus of these two presentations is really what should firms do? What should they do? So we will start off with Stefano Bruzzoni. Stefano is a past chair of the TIM division at the Academy, also professor of technology and innovation management at ETH Zurich. and he will talk about definitions and sort of a long history of ethics and innovation. So he will kick off our presentations. Then we hear from Caroline Flammer from Boston University. Caroline is one of the rising stars in corporate social responsibility area, and she will talk more about how to motivate firms to engage in ethical behavior. Then we move on, and we will have a discussion. Andy King from Boston University giving a few remarks about these presentations. Andy is a longtime leader on environmental responsibility and innovation, especially self-regulation. And then we will move on, have two presentations from Joss Lovejoy and Kristen Martin. So Joss is head of design for ethics and society at Microsoft, and formerly also people and AI research at Google. And Kirsten is professor of technology ethics at University of Notre Dame. And both of them will talk about what are firms actually doing. So about AI, about its implications, what are some of the hard decisions we are facing with AI these days. And then at the end, we will hear a little bit more from Andy, and then of course hear from all of you. So I will now turn it over to Parisa to talk about the topic of this workshop.
Thank you, Rita. Very grateful to our amazing panelists and audience today, and eagerly we are waiting to hear about our panelists' research and practice in this space. With that, I go ahead and provide a very brief introduction on why we picked this topic and why we think this topic is very timely and relevant to our today's society. Recent technologies and innovations powered by AI range a wide span of various applications, which are eventually touching daily aspects of citizens' lives. Moreover, the increasing ubiquity and rapidly expanding commercial potential of AI has spurred massive private sector investment in AI projects. AI investment has been turned as one of the top priorities of countries internationally as well. As a result, the world is on the cusp of revolutionizing many sectors through AI while raising important questions for society, the economy, and governance. While essential for addressing some of society's most pressing challenges, innovation can also have negative consequences for individuals and societies, as witnessed in previous waves of industrial revolution or in current debates around digitization, data privacy and data oligopoly, bias, consumer protection, as well as labor displacement and the future of human agency. The growing concerns raised by state regulators, consumers, and communities represent an emerging phenomenon which sheds light on the fragile trust between digital technologies and ultimate consumers and highlights the public risks of these technologies imposed on citizens. These concerns lead to a shift to a new paradigm of technology and innovation. Now more than ever highlights the importance of linking innovation more closely to people's and society's needs, rights, and values. Even though the state and Even though the state and international regulations to date are widely implemented ex post in dealing with AI consequences, organizations could make proactivity such as ethical responsibility as an asset and preempt some of these challenges. The initiatives to address this ethical responsibility can be manifested through corporate social responsibility efforts, ethical and value-based product design and managerial decisions, as well as new ways to look into shaping capitalism involving various stakeholders. In addition, governments should intervene at a minimum when private action has negative public consequences. We are looking forward to hearing from our wonderful panel today about their research and work to learn more about how they tackle these issues in this new paradigm of technology. With that, I will pass the torch.
Thank you, Parisa. And I will turn it over to Stefano to talk about more about the history and social innovation in general. And Parisa, if you can stop sharing your screen so we can have Stefano share his.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you very much to everyone, to the organizers and to the participants. Let me say the two things that I would like to say in 30 seconds before I share my screen. Basically, number one is that in order to have a discussion about research on innovation, which is informed by a discussion about ethics and responsibility, I think we need to look at not only what people do, what organizations do, what new products they put on the market, for example, but also at why they do it. We have to look at the rationale and the goals and the motivation of people and decision makers. Now, this is a challenge because observing why people do things is difficult. And I think that's the second thing I would like to say. We have now a great opportunity to really leverage complementarities between qualitative field studies and experimental work. And experimental work is really important to give us tools to actually reveal why people make certain choices. And basically, this is all I had to say. And what I do now is elaborate it in about 4 minutes, I think, right? The title is really inspired by the first question, can innovation not be social? Well, the answer is, if we just look at what people do, their behavior, it's very difficult to argue that any kind of innovation has no social impact. If you look at on this slide, this is a standard definition of social innovation in terms of new ideas that meet social needs and create new social relationships, social innovation, right? Now, if you look at this and you put that in the context of the biography of people like Henry Ford, mass manufacturing of cars, a large number of positive and negative consequences. Well, this definition, in my mind at least, would define Henry Ford as a social entrepreneur, a social innovator, and many other people from back in the day. And I'm staying with old people here just to avoid at this stage any possible contentious discussion. So looking at what people do, what kind of products are developed, the meeting of social needs, it's really not quite precise enough to have a discussion about the ethical underpinning of innovation. I think we need a better and a finer grained vocabulary to really give central stage to the motives, the objectives, the goals that people pursue in developing new things. And clearly this is a discussion about ethics, because ethics is about the understanding, the analysis, and the critique of the principles that govern a person's behavior. This is a very old discussion in social sciences, by the way, and for any of you who are interested in it, I would suggest to look at any kind of summary of Adam Smith's The Theory of Moral Sentiments, not The Wealth of Nations, but The Theory of Moral Sentiments. Remember, Smith always considered himself a moral philosopher. As a wonderful discussion about sympathy, or the extent to which people consider the needs of others in their own decisions. The discussion about the invisible hand is more inspired by the earlier work of Mandeville and other people. Again, happy to take questions on that if you have this kind of nagging questions. Now, sympathy is, in our modern jargon, something closer to what we call altruism. And this is the connection to possible ways to exploit these synergies between qualitative work and experiments. Let me translate sympathy in modern jargon using the concept of prosociality, of social preferences. Again, the extent to which people are willing to consider others, utility of others when they take decisions. Now, social preferences can be observed quite precisely in experimental settings. And this is important because if you look at this possible application, you see what I mean by complementarities between qualitative research and experimental studies, theory building, if you like, and theory testing. Some of you might be familiar with the discussion about hybrid organizations, organizations that intend to achieve both societal and business goals. A big issue in this discussion is mission drift. If you have two conflicting objectives, well, you create tensions. And there is a large discussion about how different types of structures at the organizational level can address this issue of mission drift. there is an increasing tiny discussion about the specific role that individuals play in solving these tensions. And this is where I would like to focus on for 1.5 minutes or so. Again, some of you might be familiar with the discussion about paradoxical thinking or paradoxical frame, the ability of certain individuals to keep in mind simultaneously conflicting pieces of information. Now, this is a very powerful intuition coming out of field studies based on interviews and observation that can be tested very precisely with experiments. Again, let me give you just an example. I need one additional building block before going ahead, the distinction between semi-automatic and deliberate decision-making. Semi-automatic built on routines or experience, deliberation built on thinking or description, if you use jargon from neurosciences that I use. And the challenge here is to look at whether we can, while making sense of an individual's social preferences or altruism, look at how their choices change depending on the information process mode they adopt, semi-automatic or deliberate. To do this, all you need is a very simple example of a dictator game. What you see, a dictator game is a task in which people are given a chunk of money, and they have to choose how much they keep and how much they give away. That's it. And here they do it in two modes. In deliberation, basically they see with these numbers how much they keep for themselves and how much instead they give away. 70-50 means that they keep the majority of the money for themselves and they give less to a charity of their choice. In the semi-automatic mode, after a period of training, all they see is an image. And the image is associated to a split between self and others. And they have to choose an image that implies a certain split between business and society. The general result of this kind of studies is that people who deliberate, people who think about what they do, well, they take more selfish decisions than people who take decisions on a semi-automatic mode. Now, why is it so? For a number of reasons. Let me focus on one. One is that when we take decisions in semi-automatic mode, we actually consider both the reward for business, B, and the reward for society, S. When we take decisions on deliberation, we tend to focus on the reward for business. And that's mainly down to the fact that we have a limited computational power. And when we don't have any habit or routine, if you like, to rely on, we exhaust our computational power by focusing on the reward for ourselves. So we end up taking more selfish decisions. And if you like, this is evidence that in semi-automatic mode, there is something about that paradoxical thinking story that I referred to at the beginning that comes from qualitative research. And again, this is meant to really signal, not to go into the detail of the study, but to signal that there are important complementarities between observational and experimental studies. So in summary, selfish individuals, and on average, when we play with real money, we all play selfishly, do note, become even more selfish when we process information in deliberation, in description mode. And the mechanisms is basically that when we are in experience mode, in semi-automatic mode, we basically give salience, importance to both social and economic dimensions. Basically, our goals are different. The goals we value are different when we take decisions in semi-automatic mode. This is all done by controlling for social preferences, ex ante and along the way. And so if you like, this is a little bit of evidence that by combining qualitative and experimental studies, we can actually trigger the notion of sympathy that Adam Smith long ago talked about. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stefano. And moving over to Caroline next.
First of all, thanks so much for inviting me to this panel. All right, so the question of this PDW is how to foster responsible and ethical innovation. Now, if you take a broader perspective, essentially the question boils down to how can you motivate firms to engage in more responsible corporate practices? In my view, one of the key underlying issues is that in many countries, actually most countries, including the US, the companies are not mandated to disclose non-financial information, which includes, for example, environmental, social, and governance issues. And just to give you an example, in the context of the US, the SEC merely recommends that companies disclose such information, but they don't mandate it nor offer any guidance on how to do so. And so you can imagine that this leads companies to often not disclose ethical issues or ES and G issues more generally of their companies. And so just to clarify, kind of in the context of AI and tech, probably the most relevant issues are concerning data protection, consumer protection, transparency with respect to the ethical issues of these technologies. And so these would be basically included in those social and governance issues of ES and G. So just to clarify. All right, now in absence of public governance, the question then is, can private governance elicit greater disclosure and more corporate responsible practices, and can it foster responsible innovation? Okay, so in absence of government actions, what can the private sector basically do? Now, before I continue, let me take a step back and briefly discuss what kind of trends do we see in the environmental, regulatory, and societal environment. So on one hand, companies face increased risks and costs associated with corporate inaction and irresponsible behavior. Governments increasingly take actions to address social and environmental issues, and companies also face increased pressure from social activists to address social and environmental issues. And this pressure has intensified with the use of social media. Fourth, and perhaps related to these first three, it's not surprising that investors increasingly take interest in ESG issues and pressure their portfolio companies to, on one hand, adopt a longer time orientation, to improve their ESG practices, and to disclose their practices and describe, for example, how they address potential issues. This shadow pressure is also intensified or reflected in the fact that there's an increasing number of signatories of the United Nations Principle of Responsible Investment Network. So this is the largest network of responsible investors in the world. And you can also see it reflected in the fact that more than 1/4 of all professionally managed assets globally are considered to be responsible investments. So in sum, the advocacy in support of a longer term orientation, as well as more environmental and social friendly practices, has become much more powerful over the years, which has led some of the board of directors to consider new corporate governance practices to respond to these pressures and create long-term firm value. Now, what are these tools? What are these private tools to increase long-term firm value, as well as investments in responsible innovation, responsible practices? First, board of directors can provide managerial incentives, such as linking executive compensation to long-term financial performance, or /and to social and environmental responsible practices to, again, foster long-term firm value, so improve financial performance and help increase innovation. Secondly, by taking a broader perspective and considering the interests and needs of non-shareholding stakeholders in their decision-making, companies can foster innovation and prevent knowledge leakage by mitigating the risk that employees with access to trade secrets are walking out of the door, and if they do walk out the door, that they don't speak and spill the trade secrets. And third, you can also see a recent development in terms of bond issuance. So there are green bonds, social bonds, sustainable development bonds, COVID bonds, etc. Now, with respect to AI in the tech sector, probably the social bonds and SDG bonds would be most relevant, but companies could issue these type of bonds and hereby commit to use the proceeds of their investment or of these bonds to finance responsible, innovative projects. Last but not least, and by the way, my apologies for shamelessly promoting EU research here on this slide, okay? But the fourth factor that companies could do is try to self-regulate their industry. And Andy has done a tremendous amount of work in this area with respect to, especially with respect to the natural environment. You see also work in terms of self-regulation with respect to supply chain and labor. So very similar, you know, in the tech sector with respect to AI, companies could try to self-regulate their industry. Now, what's next? Okay, what else can be done to foster responsible social innovation, and hopefully not just to foster responsible innovation, but innovation that actually helps tackle some of the grand societal challenges that we are facing, and hereby help achieve the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, which includes, for example, no poverty, zero hunger, the provision of quality education, social inclusion, climate change, etc. Now, there is a bourgeoising literature that helps tackle some of these questions. It's really exciting research going on in this area, such as social entrepreneurship, filling institutional voids, or how can you stimulate basic science to address health issues that are particularly relevant for the poor, and a recent working paper looking at women innovators, that they are more likely to innovate for women. Okay, so there's a bourgeoising literature that helps tackle these kind of questions, and I think this is really an area of potential exciting research for the future.
Thank you so much, Caroline. And I will now turn it over to Andy to discuss these two presentations.
Thank you. I have the unenviable job of going after two wonderful presentations. And as Rita identified at the beginning, my only claim to logic to being here is that I am long-term. Both Caroline and Stefano are stars, and I've just been around a long time, so I get to comment on what they're saying. And I'm going to focus on just a couple of things that I heard in their talks. And Stefano is saying that the way you get kinds of information influences your decision-making and your self-orientation in your decision-making. And if I have this right, descriptive information rather than experience information encourages more selfish decisions. And he makes this marvelous link to, I think, a neglected part of Adam Smith's work in the theory of moral sentiments, and the notion that we could create some kind of sympathy from this and sort of perhaps more of a social kind of orientation. And Caroline is talking about the pressure from outside and how that's been then reflected internally in organizations with pro-social incentives, compensation, takeover protection, capital access, I'm thinking of that with green bonds, and how that could encourage pro-social behavior. And the extrapolation from that point, although she doesn't give it, is that maybe corporate governance can have a meaningful effect on corporate social performance. But here's my question to you guys. In this session, we have been asked to consider the role that corporations can play in preventing misuses of AI. These include surveillance, ersatz content, cyber attacks, information suppression, manipulation of institutions, and killer robots from the future, Skynet. So, to what extent are the mechanisms that you have identified, psychological nudges from different ways of presenting information, social empathy, managerial incentives, up to the task?
And we are going to pose this question to both Stefano and Caroline. So 30 seconds each. Are your methods up to the task? Caroline, why don't you go first?
I was about to say I'm very emancipated and man first, but okay, I'll take it first. You know, obviously much of the literature has not specifically looked at AI and the tech sector. But kind of these ethical questions of trying to mitigate unethical behavior of companies, there's a long tradition in CSR research looking at this, correct? Not necessarily with respect to tech or AI, but more with respect to environmental pollution and labor supply chains. So one could look more deeply into the tech sector, But I'm just saying there is a lot potential to draw from, a lot of insights we could potentially draw from the CSR literature and look into the tech sector. As you probably know, the two literature streams on innovation and tech and CSR, they have not necessarily, so let me put it this way, there is potential for building a bridge between these two literatures, and I think it's about time.
Excellent, thank you. How about Stefano?
Oh, the methods are not up to the task. That, I mean, if there is one thing that history shows, is that we've been asking these questions at least since the first example of environmental regulations in Northern England, early 19th century. So these kind of regulations are super important, by all means, but there is always this kind of lag between when bad things happen and when regulations step in to try to solve them. And over time, very effectively too. I mean, there has been progress, by all means. But we are still lagging behind. And I think the Skynet question is a bloody good one. Because these methods have identified a number of triggers and nudges and instruments. All these instruments take time to deploy. And all these instruments have to be customized to the specifics of the new technology, the specifically bad thing that different technologies can deliver, hopefully without getting rid of the good things. So, no, still trying, but not yet there.
Wonderful, thank you. I wanted to summarize or integrate one question from the chat from the audience. Keep asking your questions. I encourage the panelists also to take a look at what the audience is asking. The audience is asking, what are the metrics? They're interested in us defining responsible innovation. I will have that question for us for later, but how about the metrics? Marianne Feldman is asking, you know, how do we measure if we tell managers to incentive, you know, if we want to incentivize managers, don't we first need the metrics? And others are saying, what are the metrics? Any thoughts, Caroline and Stefano, on that front?
So in terms of, let's say you try to tie executive compensation to some sort of metrics, correct, to provide incentives. This is a very good question. And this is a tricky one, especially considering the fact that in most countries, companies don't need to disclose this type of information, correct? So metrics is a fundamental issue in this area. And then also there's a risk that if you incentivize on one specific dimension, that companies would only consider this one, but then neglect all sorts of other dimensions. So fantastic question. I don't have an answer.
We have an honest panel today. Stefano, what is your take?
Let me continue on this trick of honesty. Wonderful question. God knows. Again, the problem with metrics is that any good metric stops being a good metric the moment it becomes a target in a way. So there is a little endogeneity issue there that really that doesn't help. The discussion about values is potentially very important, albeit again very slow, to a very slow discussion, to go back to Andy's point, because it would allow us to understand how we can help people through training and education and development to internalize the objectives of others, say society, over and above the metrics of the day, because again, metrics will have to change to remain valuable targets, and I think that's a little bit the challenge with the discussion I see there.
If I just may follow up very briefly. So in terms of, you know, potential metrics you could use, correct, is mitigating the number of incidents of data leakage, for example, or kind of unethical issues. And then you develop a measurement according to this, and then you tie compensation to it, for example. But this is then, you need to be creative to come up with those measures. When we did the study in terms of tying executive compensation to social and environmental responsible practices, many companies, I can tell you, many companies are extremely vague in what specific metrics to use. And if they do use specific metrics, these vary across industries, across companies. Happy to talk more about it, but I also don't want to capture the whole discussion.
Excellent. Thank you, Caroline. Stefano, thank you, Andy. We will move on and now hear from Joss and Kirsten about what are firms actually doing and moving even more focusing on AI. So what are the decisions, tough decisions to make AI and its implications? So Joss, if you're ready to share your screen,
Sure thing.
take it away.
Alrighty. Hey everyone, super happy to be here. Appreciate the invitation. It's always, I love stepping outside back and forth between the sort of the corporate environment and the academic environment to be able to refresh my brain. I lead design for a team called Ethics and Society, which is a, I still call us an experiment. We're a couple of years into the experiment, but the conceit is that if we bring together a group of different disciplined people and co-create, participatory design alongside product teams, that we can make more intentional outcomes possible. Intentional really being the word there. There's no such thing as responsible or ethical without actual relationships with real people who stand to be impacted by the technologies that we make. So we do our very best to take a more proactive approach to things. To really broaden the spectrum of understanding about what a stakeholder is and who our users are. We have a real strong grounding in user experience design and research, especially. I'm not going to linger on these slides for too long, but just a quick note. Sorry, there's the poll on the screen. We have a fundamental belief that, and I have a fundamental belief as a designer, that you have to operate out of as much knowledge as possible while really embracing your domains of ignorance. So everything we do is grounded in user research. And we specifically and proactively seek out historically marginalized or statistically underrepresented groups to be part of that process with us. So whatever technology we're working on, we first do a round of sort of envisioning and sort of anticipatory design around potential applications that are more specific. We look to see from existing literature where there might be more disproportionate or disparate impacts to individuals or groups. And then we bring those in and we have active conversations and we hold ourselves accountable to those folks. And the design process really is grounded in eliciting useful, realistic, and representative types of reactions from those people. So the reason why we take this approach is not because we're trying to come in and write the code for these teams. Really, we're trying to look around corners 6, 12, 18 months in advance so that what we leave them with is a better, more informed, more aware space than where we started. And to do that, it kind of begins with the belief that people innately, hopefully, want to do good things. And if they can see the potential beautiful futures that can be made and the potential harmful outcomes that they could be complicit in, they will be unable to unsee those things, and we can all do better. To enable that, we have a series of things that we've built together, models, frameworks, designs, all sorts of stuff. I'm just going to jam super quickly through that. This is called a harms model. This is something that we've built over the course of the last year plus, which is a spectrum of harms to individuals, people, and society, ranging from very direct manifestations of harm in terms of physical and emotional injury, all the way out to societal scale harms, where we call that erosion of democratic and societal structures. And we do a process that is similar. Some folks have done threat modeling from a security perspective, but it really tries to take this, this proactive potential harm kind of view of the world based on specific applications of the products in context across a broad range and diverse range of potential stakeholders. And then we use that to inform a set of mitigation hypotheses, which we bake into our user research and our design practice. We then build things and we file recommendations and requirements against those teams that we work with. So again, we leave them hopefully more informed than where we started. we also leave them with specific tactical and tangible recommendations and design guidelines. So we do things like redesign consent processes. We do things like design conversational situations with synthetic agents so that they are intentionally designed to fail the Turing test instead of try to pose as human beings. We try to build in situations where consent is not something that we imagine, a single privacy expert can mediate or adjudicate, but instead, how can we ask people to share with us in their own words what they felt that they were agreeing to or being asked to consent to. And finally, we write policy. We do things around incentives to some of the points that have been made before, actually trying to bake in commitments at an executive level. That's a fascinating conversation, an interesting area. But we try to take this approach that really says policy should come hand in hand with a playbook, with in practice, battle-tested design guidelines. So it shouldn't just be thou shalt not or thou shalt. It should be here's a how-to guide. Because again, let's presume that people want to do the right thing, but also that they're stressed, under-resourced, maybe lazy, maybe under-informed, probably all of the above. And so how do we get more proximate to their experience as we're getting more proximate to the user experience who we're trying to serve? Because fundamentally design is an act of service. So wrapping up, we try to cover this sort of broad spectrum in our, I would say, medium-sized team. We're about 20, 25 folks serving an organization of 50,000. So in cloud and AI on Microsoft. So we try to really dive deeply into these complex and thorny areas, looking at the model and data life cycles through tooling and process improvements, ways that we can shape products through design thinking and through user experience, through research, societal impacts, and how we connect closer with people, meeting them where they're at, and then shifting engineering cultures so that we actually do try to bake in some of those incentive processes, and that people feel like they're safe being a skeptic and also rewarded for being proactive. All of this, of course, as I said, is a grand experiment. We're seeing a lot of really interesting stuff. I'm happy to share more. And with that, I will toss it over. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Josh. Wonderful to get a practitioner, AKA the real world perspective. Much appreciated. Thank you for joining us. And I will turn it over now to Kirsten to talk more about AI.
Great,
and
thank
do
you so
check
much.
out also Kirsten's TEDx talk, by the way, after the session.
I still have people come up to me and ask me if my son is sleeping well at night, which if you see the talk, you'll understand. And I'm always a little thrown by it because he's now in college, so I don't see him. I don't know if he's sleeping well. I'm assuming that he is. So thank you very much. I really appreciate it. This is a fun discussion, and I think it's great that I'm able to follow Josh. I'm going to talk a little bit about how I think we should think about design and AI and to be more thoughtful early on in the development of AI rather than kind of expecting people in use to be able to curtail it. And I'll explain a bit in a second, but it really dovetails well with Josh's work at Microsoft and how he gets involved so early in the process to look at design. So I think, and I don't want to short shrift the part about AI being, like all technology, as being value laden and biased, having biases as to who's going to use it, having biases as to unfairness. For AI, we can have biases in the training data, in the source data, in the outcomes. There's all sorts of ways that AI can be value laden in upholding certain principles, having distribution of outcomes for different types of people being unfair, harming dignity, different ways that we can have that actually harming rights. And so I don't want to ignore that part of it. So I think we should talk more about AI in the lower half, where we talk about the training data being the history of the contextual decision as it's told by the individuals who could record the decision, the source data as the best estimates of the factors available, and not think about AI as some sort of objective measure that we take as for granted. And that's true, I want to always say, of all technology. All technology is value laden. All, the car, our washer and dryer set, it's all value laden in some way as it's designed for certain people and other people are excluded. But I want to talk a little bit more about AI decisions or bias, like all decisions. But the second part of this, which is that mistakes happen and all good decision accounts for mistakes. And so I think this is the part where we need to be more thoughtful about the governance of AI early on, is how are mistakes going to be identified, judged, and then corrected? And this is the part that I think is being too often ignored early on in development. So what do I mean by that? So when we look at this simplistic AI diagram, there are actually lots of little questions that are asked all along the way. What factors are appropriate or fair for this context? What level of accuracy is fair? So is it okay for us to be pretty close on some groups of people, but really accurate on others? What are the ethical norms around this types of decision? The training data, is the historical data biased unjustly? Are the reference points actually appropriate for this type of decision? You could imagine all these questions could be answered for, you know, an AI augmented decision, deciding hiring, deciding promotion, deciding whether an insurance claim is adjudicated or rejected in some way, whether you get a loan or whether you get insurance. These are all ways that we have AI augmented decisions, and they're very contextual, and all these questions would normally with humans being asked on a regular basis. However, sometimes with AI, we actually think about this as being hidden. So sometimes AI is actually black box so that we don't see the training data. We're not able to ask those types of questions. If it's actually black box so we don't see the source data, and it could even be the fact where we only see an outcome and that's all that we're given, and we're not able to go back and ask any questions as a user of the computer program that's been given to me. And so these questions are important. They're what Latour in Science and Technology Studies called the missing masses. And what he was saying is that when we automate a decision, and the examples that he used are a door groomer shutting a door instead of a doorman, a seatbelt holding you tight instead of, you know, kind of bracing yourself in a car, that there are all these little pieces of responsibility that are baked into the technology. And by doing that in development, by baking those little missing masses, the responsibilities of those questions, they don't disappear. They're not just all of a sudden missing in some way. The developer is actually answering those questions and making them or inscribing them, according to Ackrich, into the technology. And so when we develop AI, when computer scientists are developing AI and deciding the training data and then foisting out the computer program onto the world, selling it to somebody, they are in effect answering those types of questions, or more importantly, deciding whether or not the users could decide those questions. So what I would suggest is in development of computer programs, we need to be doing more to ask these types of questions. What is a mistake in this situation? Which types of mistakes are preferred? You know, a false positive or a false negative. That changes sometimes even in the context of one type of decision. How will the people be able to identify a mistake? How will they know if it's a bad mistake, and how will they be able to fix a mistake? I would suggest that actually development decides these types of questions. And second, they actually decide whether or not users will be able to answer those questions. And so this is an area where I think that regulations and the government needs to be involved in other areas, like I would say around privacy online and certain areas around there. Around whether or not we're able to answer these types of questions, I think will get negotiated between two companies in a contract for the actual device, for the actual computer program. Is that the receiver of the program will have to ask, how am I going to know if this is a mistake? How am I going to be able to tell if I can correct this mistake and if I'm going to be able to govern this going forward? And if the designer decides, no, you're not going to be able to answer those questions, I would argue that the designer is then taking responsibility for all of the mistakes that come after that. And that type of liability, just in the private sector, is going to kind of hold the developers accountable for the types of governance they're going to allow in the future. Which, going back to Josh's point, is why it's so important to be asking these types of questions early on in development, because it's extremely hard to answer those questions later on when technology is being used. So that's really the scope of what I want to talk about, especially within my 5 minutes. I hope I stayed within my 5 minutes. This is a little bit more tighter onto AI and the way that AI is exemplary of other technologies, and that the decisions that are made in design are critically important, and they are the most knowledgeable and in the best position to make these types of ethical decisions. And in fact, they're actually making those types of decisions for users when they start using the technology, including with AI. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kirtan. That's wonderful. And turning it over to Andy for a few remarks.
Okay, so continuing in my old guy role, I mean, back in the day, we talked about expert systems and AI as, you know, artificial intelligence is generating sort of artificial expertise. And I want to riff in that direction for a minute, if I can. And I want to show you first, oh, am I sharing my screen? I'm probably not sharing my screen. Am I sharing my screen?
Not yet. Almost there. I said you are the leader, by the by. Anyway.
The leader?
You are
Okay,
a long-time leader.
Oh, long-time leader, yes. Here's a slide from Kirsten's presentation. And this, you've got, this looks like some kind of big data kind of analysis. You've got some training data, you've got some source data, you've got an algorithm, and you're coming up with some outcomes. Is that fair, reasonably, that this is sort of, okay. And if you look at this, we do this. We all do this as experts, as human experts. We pick the training data. We pick the models that we're going to run. We pick the source data. We have outcomes. We report those outcomes. And we report those outcomes in journals. You can imagine an AI system might report some kind of prediction that the user might care about. So I'm going to say that to some extent what Kirsten did is she brought in sort of AI's problem to our own general knowledge problem. She's sort of saying this: the creation of empirically based algorithms and evidence and findings are subject to Hume's problem of assumption. What do we assume? All those stages through that she's describing, the original researcher is making those assumptions. And Gelman's problem of forking paths. There are so many ways through all those assumptions. You may end up with different kinds of outcomes at the end, different kinds of brittleness, different kinds of results. And the implication of that is, in the same way, when we read a research report, we face what's called a testimony problem. We don't know whether we should believe the research report or not. We have the same problem with AI. Should I trust this recommendation? Should I trust this output that the AI has generated? And in both cases, there's this human decision maker walking through all these choices along the way that influences the outcome. And so Josh, Josh's stuff is so huge, and it's organizational, and it's got this it's information provision part that actually also goes back to the environment. Josh, early on in the environmental, when regulations came in, organizations put out people like you into the business units to make sure that the people were making good decisions about pollution and recyclability and so same kind of thing. So great, wonderful. I want to focus on the text-to-speech part. And I read his rules. And what's interesting to me about these rules are, one rule that they had is, you want the text-to-speech to sound like not a human. So you basically want the hearer to know the competence level of this person on the other side. They're a computer, they're not a human. And also programmed in the rules are sincerity. You can't deceive, you can't misinform, you can't dissemble, you can't lie. What was interesting to me about that is competence and sincerity are thought by philosophers of science as the conditions under which you can trust the information you're getting from another person. They were thinking about human beings, but as Kirsten's pointed out, that could be an artificial expert as well. So here's my wackadoodle question. Most philosophers of science believe that evaluating the veracity of human testimony is so difficult that the need for learning from testimony is so great that we should just trust presumptively human testimony unless we have a clear and overriding reason not to. I know that sounds weird, but we trusted people when we were kids, when they taught us about American history. We trusted people when they taught us about math. We trust strangers when they tell us about instructions. We trust, we trust, we trust. Would you make the same argument for AI? Or if not, how can someone, an observer, practically evaluate the AI-created testimony that we receive? So if we have an AI doctor telling us something, if we have a real doctor telling us something, the advice from philosophers is just believe it. If we have an AI system telling us something, does that just believe it rule, presumptive trust, still hold?
I'm happy to answer it. I
Yeah,
think
dive in.
philosophy of science, they say presumptively trust, but humans don't do that. So I think you're onto something that we should have the same level of expectations of a more augmented decision than a less augmented decision. It's almost like a range, right? Like, so it's the example that you gave about doctors using AI. When at Duke Medical, when they use AI to identify tumors, there's still a human involved all along the way. Like they purposely insert themselves when they don't have to. They don't have to actually check off and make sure that they agree with the AI decision. Because it's a pivotal decision, it's very important to people's lives, they insert themselves. So there's kind of a range of fully automated to fully human decisions. But I actually think we should have the same level of expectation around someone answering, why did you hire that person, of a person as we would an augmented decision when the AI said, you should hire Kirsten, and we should be able to understand why. So I don't think the level of veracity, belief is any different. In that way, I agree with you. I don't think we should judge AI decisions differently than human decisions. I just don't think there's like, I don't trust my doctor all the time. So I just don't think that there's like a deference to trust of a human testimony. And we do in courts, we do this all the time. You know, there's no presumptive. You have to listen to someone and see if you trust them, if they sound credible or not. There's no one says you should presume to trust that person. That doesn't happen, you know, in the courts.
There's a lot to unpack in your provocations, all of which are super fascinating. One quick thing, we say it's not actually a question of the voices sounding not realistic. And so we do try to go into more depth in the design guidance. It's that the fidelity of the voice should match the fidelity of the interaction paradigm, and that people need to be in on the deception. Because the quirky tension, and I think this really extends off of what Christian is saying, all of which I agree with, is that people want to be able to trust their cognition. When we conduct research about the fidelity of synthetic data, people love the sound of the most realistic voices, to the point where we actually control the conditions and have a real human speaker, and they love that the most. Believing that it is indeed synthetic, but they hate to be deceived. And they especially hate to be deceived in social contexts, where the social contract is one where they can expect reliability interpersonally. So the difference is that we have plenty of deceptions in our lives. If you pay an admission to go to a movie theater, remember when we could go to theaters together and sit in places? But if you pay admission to go to a movie theater, or you listen to music, or you play a video game, or you go to an amusement park, you're in on the deception. That's critical. But if you're in a context where you expect to be able to trust the veracity of the information, you are no longer in on that deception, and therefore it is incumbent on the designer to be able to properly disclose the synthetic nature. And the other thing I'll just toss in, again, kind of augmenting what Christian was talking about, is one place where I think I just have kind of a subtle distinction, which is, while there is kind of a default to truth theory interpersonally between people, there is definitely an automation bias that exists between people and machine. And so time and time again, we see that there's an expectation of objectivity and accuracy when people interact with AI. And because it's probabilistic in nature, it's going to make all sorts of mistakes. And again, everything that Christian wrote about the outcomes and the black box and whatnot. So the difference to me, ethically, is about the affordance design. Because if you're designing an AI system to present itself as objective and truthful or what have you, then you are deceiving people. If you are presenting an AI system to be innately fragile, and you're designing it such that there is a feedback loop of real active learning and relationship building and mental modeling for users, then you're in a different place. And so there's a fundamental distinction there in how, like, what your objective functions are, and how you think about the optimization paradigms that are going into your modeling.
I would agree 100% with what Josh just said. In fact, I think our default is to believe that the difference to technology, the objective, believing that AI is giving us a real answer, the objective truth, the accurate representation, is so strong that even just to hold them to the same criteria of human decision making is all we're asking. Like, we're not saying that we have to defer less to them. It's almost like we just have to bring it off the pedestal to say, like, just pretend it's an augmented human decision and just ask the same questions. And so in some way, I'm just trying to get to parity. I just don't want it to be exalted. In fact, when I hear it exalted, I find it, like Josh said, it's dangerous because we're giving them a false sense of security around a decision that's hugely as faulty as any human decision. It's not better necessarily. So
Great. Thank you so much for sharing. And I wanted to take this moment to thank our panelists and our wonderful discussant for insightful talks and observations. And I, at this point, wanted to turn it over to our audience. First of all, I have shared the poll results. You trust the government. You want the government to regulate AI. There's an overwhelming majority who says it's the government's job to make sure we are all safe. With that, I wanted to ask one question. Carolina and few others have posted a question in chat about kind of throwing the baby away with the bathwater. So if we are providing this negative definition of responsible or ethical innovation, this is what Caroline Castaldi writes, you know, how is this framework working out in practice, for example, for JAWS, and are we potentially missing out on some positive elements? JAWS, can you address this question? What are your thoughts? Are we missing out on some positive things here?
It's a great question, and one that gives me a lot of heartburn. You know, developing the harms modeling practice was literally a process of like sitting alone, thinking about the worst possible things that could be outcome from what I think are usually sort of the accidental transgressions for so many reasons that I can't even go into. I get into this business. I've been a product designer for whatever, 16, 17 years because I'm an optimist. And I fundamentally, I posit that almost every data scientist, engineer, product manager, they get into it because they're problem solvers and they're optimists as well. People aren't trained up on thinking about negativity. We're all really good at skeptics. The English language includes a lot more words for negative valence than positive ones, but yet we are inversely incentivized. It's hard to be a skeptic in a corporate context. You risk being that person, the one who distrusts their colleagues, the one who wants to impede progress, the one who is just a tinfoil hat wearer or a pessimist or what have you, and you lose social cachet when you bring up potential harmful outcomes. It's an unfortunate reality of the corporate environment. Not to mention the types of things that you might accidentally disclose out of attorney-client privilege that could bring massive financial ruin to your organization. So again, it's hard to bring up tough subjects. So what we do with harms modeling is not say this is the only way, but we introduce something early on, in addition to a bunch of positive stuff that I didn't talk about, but we introduce a place early on where everyone has the license to come into a shared space of being honest about the things that concern them, the futures that they don't want to bring about. And through that, we create a shared currency that we can continue to come back on and draw from, like a well of understanding, of shared understanding that takes us months and years out in the future. And we've seen it work really, really effectively for that reason. Anyway, I can speak more on it, but it's a fantastic point. The quick summary is people don't struggle to think about awesome stuff to do, but they do struggle feeling like they have, like it's okay socially to say, I'm a little uncomfortable. Have we thought about this? And that's one of the things that's enabling when you have something that feels a little more formal and a little more structured and temporary.
Excellent, that's terrific. So we wanted to hear from the audience now questions to all the panelists. And if Jack, if you are still on the call, do you want to ask your question about regulation frameworks and privacy and effectiveness of AI in person? If you can unmute yourself. And
sure.
And if you want, so tell us if you want everybody to answer or if this is for one of the panelists.
Great. I think I might have just frozen. Let's give me a couple of seconds to hopefully unfreeze.
We can hear you just fine.
Yep, good. Okay, good. I'm unfrozen. Yeah. So for any of the panelists, certainly Josh would have a perspective, but I think all of them will have some perspective of how regulators and how regulations should help. Are there any frameworks that you have to help regulators balance between the privacy, the primacy of privacy, and the effectiveness of being able to do things with AI? I'm thinking, for example, in healthcare, right, where in order to do stuff, you need to offset that privacy with being able to improve patient safety by being able to access specific information. So are there some frameworks to think about that? Because what happens, it seems to me, is people who have undue influence perhaps are able to push things a little to one side or the other side based on their own perspectives. So, you know, how might there be some framework there, or do you have any ideas?
I'm going to cold call the panelists unless somebody jumps in.
I'm happy to offer a first while folks are gathering thoughts. It's a great question. There's sort of two things that jump to mind, maybe three. The first is we have a problem kind of fundamentally with the way that we tend to see regulation carried out. It's usually sort of it's a first actor disincentive. So companies are all afraid, like all of them. I've worked at a number of they're all afraid of being honest about their intent because they're concerned about how it can be misread. And it's much easier to sit back and let somebody take the first action and take the hit. And so, you know, when I talk to regulators, which is weird because I'm a designer and I'm still getting used to that, I talk about intent. And they say to me, if there could be a way where you could share this intent framework, then suddenly we can ask different types of questions to other companies about intent. But it's a real struggle to be able to get that through all the different layers of honestly of corporate liability concerns. So that's one of the first things is how can regulators take kind of a more proactive approach to creating spaces where it's safe, Chatham House rules or whatever, for different companies to come in and talk about intent. And we should be, you know, we shouldn't be making ethics a proprietary thing, but we are forcing that because of how litigious things are. The second point I'll just make briefly is about what people talk about as the, you know, trade-offs or tensions between AI quality, AI model quality, and privacy. Fantastic points. And there's two critical things to think about. One is, do you actually need to store and process those data and have people look at them in a supervised learning way? It's not always needed. There are, thankfully, more than enough frameworks today, whether it's storage, from a storage perspective, differential privacy, which are, you know, cryptographic or mathematical proofs about the inability to re-identify an individual given a large enough aggregate sample, or federated learning or federated optimization or differential optimization, ways that you can have people put into aggregate pools and then train on sort of local maxima, and then improve global models as a result. So there are definitely techniques for unsupervised or semi-supervised, but fully eyes off types of things that can improve local models, right? Local models improve for individuals, which is great. You're returning value to the individuals, and Apple's doing a phenomenal job of leaning into that area.
But that becomes harder. That becomes harder when you have multiple silos and you have to somehow aggregate data across different players.
It can, and that leads me to my second point, which is meaningful consent. And our team classifies meaningful consent as when people tell us, like I mentioned in the little brief intro, people tell us they actually understood, they were aware of when they're being asked, they had freedom of choice in the process, and they have the necessary controls that didn't force them to sacrifice minimum viable app functionality. And what we find in practice is when you talk about the types of collective good and the intent and who will have access to the data and that you won't resell it, people are actually cool with consenting and raising the collective waterline. But again, it's about that balance of integrity, honesty, intent, and you have to take that risk of saying, we're going to do this, even though it might bring closer inspection from regulation.
How about Caroline, Stefano, Kirsten? Andy, any thoughts here?
I don't have specific thoughts, but I thought I would send you a quick link to how the UNPI, so the Principle of Responsible Investing community, tries to tackle not necessarily AI, but cybersecurity, which is a big issue. And I'm just going to send you the link. I'm no expert in this field specifically, so I'm going to give the word to somebody else.
I'm going to move on to Stephanie. Oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
I'm going to move, okay, I'll move on to Stephanie Kelly's question. If Stephanie, you are on the call about accidental errors, not malicious errors, and how we could measure them. Let me see if you're still on the call.
Yeah, thank you very much. And thank you to all the panelists. So actually, Josh took some of the words out of my mouth. I think you mentioned that in your hopes that most of the ethical issues that happen with AI are in fact accidental. So this is very different from the way that we have traditionally looked at unethical behavior in the literature, which is often malicious or purposeful intent, and especially the way that it's measured. So often it's, have I as an individual in my organization viewed or seen somebody else perform something or do something unethical? So linking back to the metrics discussion we've had, we're starting to think about how can we measure unethical behavior or unethical AI in an organization. So perhaps, Caroline, Kirsten, really anybody, but what are some of those challenges, and perhaps how might we overcome them from an academic standpoint, measuring not just malicious or intentful behavior, but accidental behavior and ultimately accidental outcomes from the technology?
I would actually like to link it. I think it's a very good question. And I would like to link it also back to the previous question about, well, we are focusing on the unethical behavior, but what about actually more positive, correct? How can you encourage more positive type of behavior? And I mean, one way to measure those things is those accidents that Josh refers to, like the behavior you try to prevent. Now, this of course requires companies to track those incidents. And the other question is, do we as researchers have access to that information? So this is where the crux of the story starts, correct? Like for public companies, unless they have to disclose this type of information, it's very difficult for researchers to get access to it. And then the key is for companies essentially to track it, at least for themselves. On the negative side, the unethical type of behavior that you try to prevent, those accidents, but also perhaps try to motivate more positive type of behavior. And then in terms of the more positive, I would try to link it to the UN SDGs, which I think Netra pointed out. So just to provide you some insights about the development of what's going on SASB side, for example, the Sustainable Accounting Standard Board, as well as the PRI. The SASB, which tries to, one of their goals is to entice companies to disclose ESG information, which includes, transparency of data protection, consumer protection, etc. So because of the absence of government regulation, because governments don't take actions, SASB basically tries to step into this area and foster the disclosure of ESG information, and it tried to provide guidance on what kind of information is disclosed, what kind of metrics, because there are thousands of metrics you could report. But of course, in order to make a meaningful report so that it's meaningful for analysts and researchers and the rest of the world, it should be standardized. And so what they do is provide guidance on what is called financial material issues, social issues, environmental issues, governance issues. So this would be a starting point. One thing to keep in mind is, in order to get a broad buy-in from industry to actually disclose this type of information, they really go according to the accounting standards, meaning financial material within 1 year. So first of all, financial material, correct? Second of all, within 1 year, that means many of those environmental and social issues are not short-term, they are longer-term. They might take a long period of time to materialize, so they would not be captured. So currently the PRI and SASB are talking, because the PRI's objective is to help achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, which are much more long-term. And so what they try to do is come up with metrics that not only identify material issues to the company, but also issues that help achieve those and help tackle some of the grand societal challenges that we are facing. So this would be, if you try to motivate positive behavior, this is where I would look at. But how do you get access to that data? That's another question.
Thank you, Caroline. Anybody else? Kirsten, go ahead.
I would say, you know, so I'm a business ethicist, that's my field. And so I normally teach just general problems in business or good things in business. And we actually look at inadvertent ethical acts all the time. I mean, sometimes you have like an Andy Fastow at Enron that clearly was intent on committing fraud. Like that, we do have bad actors like that do things on purpose. But we have a lot of times that someone just by negligence does something that's actually harmful, and we look back at the company to try to find out, why didn't you have safeguards in place to protect? And it's not exactly intentional in the way of like a really bad actor. It's a little bit more complicated in that you have a whole lot of negligence, maybe a little bit of a bad actor, but it's not as clear. So I actually don't find the issues that we're facing now that different than the normal business ethics issues that we face all the time, of trying to get people not to commit fraud at Google, you know, and we also want them to develop AI correctly. I mean, so I don't see them as that decidedly different. But I would say, I think you make an excellent point that goes back to why we shouldn't focus and demonize mistakes too much, because it will give companies an incentive not to look for mistakes, right? Like, so if we demonize mistakes as biases, they are, and they should be fixed and identified. We more need to focus on an unethical algorithm or AI is one that doesn't have the mechanism to identify mistakes. And that will give them an incentive to actually figure out, well, okay, mistakes will happen. But the question is, if you didn't have something in place to identify the mistakes and correct it, that's the focus. And so I think you make a great point in there. We could actually, if you focus too much on inadvertent mistakes and then you kind of demonize them and say that they're biased and harmful and unethical, then you have this problem that no one's going to want to identify them. You know, they're not going to tell you about them, and that's the wrong thing. And so I do think that we need to focus on the idea that governance of the AI is the most important thing, and that's where developers have to focus.
I wanted to get one more question in from Shahab Musavi, if you are still on the call, about AI taking over in a positive way. Shahab, if you can unmute yourself and ask your question, and please address it to one person in the panel because we have to move to closing remarks pretty soon.
Yes, indeed. So hi there, everyone. So thank you very much for all the presentations today. It's been really great listening to all you. And I'm sorry, I wasn't ready to turn on my video and ask the question. So I'm going to start off by saying that I'm coming in from a solely AI background. And this is a world of optimistic, oh, AI is the future and everything, and then hearing everything that was said today, especially the portion about saying that we need to say that people, we have to let them know that they're talking to a chatbot. I'm thinking, I'm coming in from the side that this seems like the inevitable future. at least from where I'm coming from, apparently not for everybody. And what I'm thinking is, do you believe that at the end of the day, we would actually need to do this as opposed to just accepting that people need to fix these biases and be able to come up with an AI that is actually accurate in the sense that people might actually even prefer to talk to it as opposed to talking to a human. For example, I've been talking with call centers. Yeah.
So who would like to take this intriguing viewpoint?
So if I understood the question is, do we have to have these ethical rules and guidances, the amazing things that Josh is doing? Or can some kind of feedback system correct for the problem and select for good companies versus bad companies, or good AI versus bad AI, so that we end up with the winning technologies, the winning firms are doing it right? Is that correct?
I wouldn't necessarily disparage it with why would we need to have these ethical guidelines. I just like to say that, for example, having these ethical guidelines, but then having it be within the poll, I voted for the private sector managing it as opposed to the government. And that's because I believe that at the end of the day, if you want the government to manage it, there's always going to be a way for these companies to go through loopholes. And then, for example, have them be held accountable, for example, in their stock. I believe I believe companies care much more about their stock value than they do about a lot of these policies, as long as they don't get caught. And then the fact that, for example, it was said that we want this to sound robot-like, which is very counterintuitive to our way of thinking, where we're trying to make it sound much more human-like as much as possible. I'm just saying that trying to have these internalize in them, and then at the end of the day, maybe having this be the default that when the people I'm talking to are robots, they're just talking better than humans. And if right now, when I get a robot, for example, I call AT&T, I just work to find my way to be able to talk to a human, because I think they can resolve my problem better, hoping that someday we can get the opposite.
So if I can just jump in, I think your comment brings back what Stefano brought up earlier on, sort of this idea of this invisible hand versus this idea of moral sentiments. And I think one of the problems with the invisible hand is it only works occasionally, and it only works when consumers have good information, and it only works when there's not externalities, and only under those two circumstances will we end up with good outcomes. Otherwise, the bad may win out, and we may end up with really egregious kinds of behavior. And I think what you're seeing here is, yes, firms care about their stock price, and so presumably that's why Josh has his job, and Microsoft cares about their stock price, but that's not going to be enough. We're going to still need ways that civil society keeps these things policed. We're going to have regulation that takes place. We're going to have all of these mechanisms. I mean, that's sort of my original question. I'm very skeptical that the things that we have talked about here are sufficient, and we're going to have to find more and more of these moving forward and use, I think, regulation and ethics and everything to make it work.
Excellent, thank you both. And I would like to close this session with a few closing remarks from everybody in the panel, starting from Stefano. And so what's not being said that needs to be said, keep it to 30 seconds if I can ask academics to do so. So Stefano, what's on your mind as closing remarks?
I think spending quite a bit of time studying humans and human intelligence, I think the discussion was super interesting and fascinating. I think we've been talking a lot about the artificial element of artificial intelligence, the algorithm, the data, that kind of stuff, and less so about the intelligence part of it. So what do we mean by intelligence when we talk about AI versus what we mean by intelligence when we talk about it in humans? I think that is very much related, in my mind at least, to the question by Shahab, which is super important and very difficult. So I think basically that's a question about intelligence, generally, not so much about AI specifically.
Thank you, Caroline.
So first, I'm delighted to see that we have such a panel. I'm delighted to see we have this type of conversation. Secondly, to me, the conversation about ethical and responsible innovation with respect to AI and tech sector, it reminds me so much of conversations from environmental protection to labor issues, supply chains, to actually what's going on in the finance industry, correct? They started from negative screening of excluding companies that engage in unethical behavior towards more the positive side of things. So I'm delighted to see the tech sector is moving into that direction as well. Do I trust the government to take charge of everything? We shall discuss on a different day.
Depends on the leaders and the government, I guess. Thank you, Caroline. And Joss, what's on your mind?
I'm really interested to key in on intent, always, always, always. And so I'll leave you with kind of one distinction between things that like are uniquely human and things that are uniquely mechanistic or AI. People thrive on novelty. Our memories are pretty fallible, whereas machines have perfect recall and thrive on memory and repetition, actually. People ask questions out of pure curiosity, and they do a lot of things out of trying to save energy and survive longer. Machines are able to respond instantly, but again, based on memory and recall, or at least some notion of patterns that have been picked up on more rigid rules. People get distracted, but they explore things, and machines are able to focus on tasks when set to them. And so to me, it starts with if you've got something where you can augment human expertise along the vectors of saving them, doing something more quickly, preserving memory, or doing something that augments their focus or their ability to pay attention, so that they can choose to do more things intentionally, more human, then you're in a really good spot. But if you're trying to replace people with machines, well, then you're just going to have kind of a poor puppet. And I know that's a little bit of a hot take to leave you with, but that's what machines do, is they try to mimic.
Cool. Thank you, Kirsten.
Well, thank you again for the panel. It's been really exciting to have it in this setting, especially within TIM and not just a bunch of philosophers that don't know the technology. So it's great to be with people that know the technology. I would actually bring it back to what we know a little bit within business. There's actually more than one market. We've focused a lot on stockholders here, just that has come up, but there's also users and labor markets that put pressure on companies. And I think an interesting thing to follow, we focus also on consent with users, but there is a wave within the labor market for folks that could actually be really good at designing AI. And there was an article in the Times in January about it. I have one in college that declined a position somewhere and then wanted to tell them why he was declining the position as a computer science engineer. So I just think it's interesting that there is a generation that's very mindful of what companies are doing and wants to tell them, you need to shape up or I'm going to move on. So that's an interesting place to look at. In the beginning, it was asked about metrics that could be used. One thing that we find as metrics that foster unethical behavior is the focus on shareholder wealth maximization. It gets people to be really myopic and short-term focused. It's how we get selling vaping to teenagers, literally. I mean, that's the only benefit to that is the shareholder wealth maximization. When you focus on the long-term value of the firm or on values and mission, actually a lot of the unethical behavior gets ferreted out. You don't have the stake in unethical behavior. So that's true though across the board, not just with AI and technology, just in general, the more broader and long-term focused, a lot of those problematic behaviors get, washed away. But anyway, I would just say if we focus on some of the general markets that we know within business that we need to worry about, I think that's also something important to realize when we're thinking specifically about AI and technology.
So thank you so much. We're officially at the end of our time today. So I wanted to thank all the panelists. So on behalf of Andy, Parisa, and myself, it's been such a pleasure to see everyone online, and you've been a really active audience in chat. So do check out the chat. There's a lot of good links, a lot of good discussion going on. Thank you for participating in the poll. And of course, thank you to everyone for tuning in and for the TIM division sponsoring us today. And we look forward to the next TIM event in a in a few weeks. So thank you so much, everybody, and hope to see you soon.
Thank you.
And virtual claps to all the panelists and everybody today. Thank you so much.